I watched my sister, Mireille, slide our mother's vintage Mikimoto pearls into her silk-lined clutch, her movements as fluid and unbothered as if she were merely picking up a spare set of keys. She didn't know I was standing in the shadow of the hallway, watching through the crack in the mahogany door. My mother wasn't even cold yet. The hospital bed in the dining room had been wheeled out only 6 hours ago, leaving a rectangular indentation in the rug that looked like a shallow grave. "Those were promised to me, Mireille," I said, my voice coming out thinner than I intended. She didn't jump. Mireille doesn't startle, she simply adjusts. She turned slowly, her face a mask of practiced, mournful elegance. "Tallies, don't be morbid. I'm just keeping them safe. You know how disorganized you get when you're emotional. We wouldn't want them lost in the chaos of the estate clearing." The chaos she referred to was the life I had put on hold for 3 years to change our mother's linens, crush her pills into applesauce, and listen to her lungs fill with fluid, while Mireille sent "thinking of you" bouquets from her brownstone 4 states away. I walked into the room, the scent of antiseptic still clinging to the curtains despite the open windows. The house, a sprawling, drafty Victorian in a town that had forgotten its own name, felt heavier than it had this morning. It was filled with the things my mother had curated with a surgeon's precision: bone china, hand-stitched lace, and the heavy silver service that sat on the sideboard, tarnished black from my recent neglect. "The will is very specific," I said, my pulse thrumming in my fingertips. "The jewelry comes to me, the house goes to you. That was the trade we discussed with the lawyer." Mireille snapped the clutch shut. The sound was like a bone breaking. "The will was written before the second stroke, Tallies, before you convinced her that you were the only one who cared. Honestly, the way you isolated her. It's been a topic of conversation among the cousins for months." I felt a coldness settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the draft. Isolation. That was the word she was using for the grueling, 24-hour cycle of caregiving that had turned my hair gray at 34 and left me with a bank account drained by incidentals that insurance didn't cover. "I didn't isolate her," I whispered. "I was the only one who stayed." "And you'll be rewarded for your martyrdom, I'm sure," Mireille said, stepping toward me. She smelled of expensive bergamot and something metallic. She patted my cheek, a gesture that felt more like a threat than a comfort. "But let's be realistic. You haven't worked in years, you have no savings. You can't afford the taxes on the jewelry, let alone the upkeep of your own life. I'm doing this for your own good. We're going to sell the collection as a whole. It'll provide a nice little, restarting fund for you." She moved past me, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. She was headed for the kitchen, likely to check if I'd polished the silver she intended to list on an auction site by Monday. I stood in the center of our mother's bedroom, staring at the empty velvet bust where the pearls had lived for 40 years. My mother had always said that Mireille was the sturdy one, the one who understood the value of a dollar, while I was the soft one, the one who understood the value of a moment. In my mother's eyes, it was a compliment to both of us. In reality, it had given Mireille a license to treat my life like a resource she was entitled to harvest. I followed her into the kitchen. She was already opening the cabinets, humming a low, tuneless song. She pulled out a drawer and frowned at a stack of unpaid medical bills I'd hidden under a tea towel. "We'll need to go through the safe deposit box tomorrow," she said, not looking at me. "I've already spoken to the bank. Since I'm the executor, they've cleared my access." My breath hitched. "You're the executor. Mom told me she changed it to joint status." Mireille finally looked at me, a flicker of something sharp and triumphant dancing in her eyes before she veiled it with pity. "She meant to, I'm sure, but the paperwork, well, it seems it never quite got filed. I checked this morning." The room tilted. The last 3 years flashed before me, the nights I spent crying in the hallway so Mom wouldn't hear, the jobs I turned down, the relationships that withered because I couldn't leave the house for more than an hour. Mireille hadn't just been absent, she had been waiting. She had waited for the moment I was most exhausted, most depleted, to step in and claim the spoils of a war she never fought. "I'm going to bed, Tallies," she said, closing the drawer. "You look terrible. Try not to overthink things. We'll handle the hard parts together." She left the kitchen, leaving me alone with the blackening silver and the pile of debt. I looked at the silver teapot, the one my grandmother had brought over on a boat. I saw my own reflection in the tarnish, distorted, pale, and unrecognizable. Mireille thought I was broken by the grief. She thought I was too tired to see the game she was playing. But as I sat there in the silence of the dead house, I realized that for the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to look after anyone else. I reached out and touched the cold, dark metal of the teapot. I wasn't going to sleep. I had a lot of filing to do, and I knew exactly where Mother kept the unfiled papers. The house breathed around me, a symphony of settling floorboards and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Mireille was upstairs in the guest suite, the room with the best linens and the view of the rose garden, while I sat on the linoleum floor of the kitchen, the cold seeping through my leggings. I knew my sister's patterns. Mireille didn't just steal, she curated. She would spend the next few days organizing the estate, which really meant scrubbing my presence from the house until I looked like an intruder in my own home. To her, I was just a live-in nurse who happened to share her DNA, a temporary fixture to be discarded once the heavy lifting was done. I stood up, my knees popping in the silence. I didn't go to my bedroom. Instead, I headed toward the back of the house, to the small, windowless room my mother had called her oratory. It was a cramped space filled with filing cabinets, old tax returns, and a roll-top desk that smelled of cedar and stale peppermint. My mother, Calla, had been a woman of secrets, but she was also a woman of immense guilt. She knew the burden she had placed on me. In those final months, when her speech was thick and her hands trembled, she would often pull me close and whisper, "It's all in the blue folder, Tallies. Don't let her take the light from the room." I had been too tired then to ask what she meant. I had just kissed her forehead and told her to rest. Now, the weight of those words felt like a physical pressure against my chest. I began to dig. I bypassed the folders labeled insurance and utilities. I ignored the property tax files. I was looking for the blue folder. It wasn't in the main drawer. It wasn't in the locked cabinet. I felt a surge of panic. Had Mireille already been here? Had she scrubbed this room too? I slumped into the desk chair, burying my face in my hands. The sense of defeat was overwhelming. I looked down at the floor, and that's when I saw it. The corner of the rug was slightly turned up. Beneath the heavy oak leg of the desk, tucked into the gap between the wood and the floorboards, was a slim, cerulean edge. I strained, bracing my shoulder against the desk to shift its weight. With a grunt of effort, I managed to slide the folder out. It wasn't just a folder. It was a ledger of everything Mireille had done while I was busy changing bandages. Inside were carbon copies of checks my mother had written to Mireille over the last 3 years. $5,000 for emergency home repairs. $8,000 for medical consultation fees. $12,000 for a loan. The total was staggering. While I was struggling to buy groceries, Mireille had been systematically siphoning off Mother's liquid assets under the guise of helping with the estate management. But it was the letter at the back that made my breath stop. It was dated 3 weeks ago. It was in my mother's shaky, labored handwriting, addressed to her lawyer, a man named Mr. Sterling. "Dear Arthur, I cannot say this to Tallies because she is too kind to hear it. She thinks Mireille is just busy. I know Mireille is taking. I am letting her take because I am too tired to fight, and I need Tallies focused on me, not on her sister's greed. But Arthur, the joint executorship is a lie Mireille told me she would file. I found the unsigned papers in the trash. I have hidden the real codicil in the one place Mireille will never look, the place she considers worthless." The letter ended there. It was never mailed. I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I shoved the folder under my sweater, pressing it against my skin. A shadow fell across the doorway. Mireille stood there, wrapped in a cream-colored pashmina, her hair perfectly brushed even at 2:00 a.m. She looked at the open desk, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of a hawk. "What are you doing in here, Tallies? I thought you were sleeping." "I couldn't sleep," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "I was looking for the warranty for the boiler. It's making a noise." Mireille stepped into the small room, her presence making the walls feel like they were closing in. She walked to the desk and ran a finger over the dust-free spot where the folder had been. She looked at me, her smile thin and devoid of warmth. The boiler is my concern now, dear. I told you I'm the executor. You need to stop worrying about the house and start worrying about where you're going to live. I've looked at the accounts. Theirs, significantly less than I expected. Mom must have been more frivolous than we realized. She was gaslighting me to my face, standing 3 feet away from the evidence of her own theft. Frivolous, I repeated. She didn't leave the house for 2 years, Mireille. She spent her money on medicine and bread. Mireille sighed, a sound of exaggerated patience. Age does strange things to the mind. Maybe she hid it. Maybe she lost it. Either way, the house needs to be listed by the end of the month. I've already contacted a stager. They'll be here Tuesday to start removing the clutter. Clutter, my mother's life, my last 3 years. Tuesday, I said. That's the day after the funeral. Efficiency is a form of kindness, Tallies. It helps the healing process. She reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. Her hand was ice cold. Go to bed, you're shaking. I watched her walk away, her silhouette disappearing into the darkness of the hall. I waited until I heard her bedroom door click shut before I let out the breath I'd been holding. I looked down at the folder tucked against my ribs. I knew where Mireille would never look. I knew what she considered worthless. I walked back to the kitchen and looked at the sink. In the corner sat a stack of my mother's old, stained recipe journals. They were flour-dusted, grease-spotted, and falling apart at the seams. To Mireille, they were trash, relics of a domestic life she looked down upon. I picked up the top one, Summer Preserves, 1994. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the pages. Between a recipe for strawberry jam and a hand-drawn diagram for pruning hydrangeas, I found it. A single notarized page, the codicil. It didn't just make me a joint executor. It did something much more devastating to Mireille's plans. I read the words twice, a slow, hot fire beginning to burn in my chest. Mireille wanted efficiency. I would give her efficiency. But first, I was going to let her spend her own money staging a house she no longer had the right to sell. The morning of the funeral was gray and suffocating, the kind of day where the mist clings to your skin like a damp wool blanket. Mireille had orchestrated the entire service with the cold efficiency of a corporate product launch. She sat in the front pew, draped in designer mourning weeds, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief that had belonged to our grandmother, another safety acquisition from Mom's dresser. I sat beside her, feeling like a ghost. I wore a simple black dress I'd had for a decade, the fabric slightly tight across the shoulders. Every time the minister mentioned Calla's devoted daughters, Mireille would lean slightly into me, a calculated show of sisterly solidarity for the benefit of the pews behind us. "You're doing so well, Tallies," she whispered under the cover of a hymn. "Just keep that dignified face on. We're almost through it." She wasn't talking about grief. She was talking about the performance. To Mireille, the funeral was the final hurdle before she could legally dismantle the estate and erase the evidence of her consultation fees. After the graveside service, we returned to the house for the wake. Mireille had hired caterers, using the estate's dwindling cash, naturally, who moved through our kitchen like silent invaders, replacing our chipped mugs with rented porcelain. I stayed in the kitchen, ostensibly to help, but really to keep an eye on the stack of recipe journals. I had tucked the codicil back into the Summer Preserves book, which now sat innocently on the counter next to a tray of crustless cucumber sandwiches. "Tallies, dear, could you go upstairs and find the silver cake server?" Mireille asked, breezing in. She looked invigorated, the adrenaline of being the center of attention acting like a tonic. "The one with the ivy leaf pattern. Mr. Sterling just arrived, and I want everything to look perfect when we sit down to talk later." Mr. Sterling, the lawyer. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. "I'll find it," I said. As I climbed the stairs, I heard her greeting Mr. Sterling in the foyer. Her voice was pitched in that specific frequency she used for men of status, breathful, slightly helpless, yet impeccably poised. "I didn't go for the cake server. I went to the hallway window that looked down onto the driveway. A sleek, black SUV was parked there. The stagers. Mireille hadn't even waited for the guests to leave. Two men in polo shirts were already unloading rolls of plastic wrap and neutral-toned throw pillows. She was moving fast because she knew that once the house was staged and the personal items were boxed, it became harder to contest the reality of the sale. It's a psychological tactic. Make the home look like a house, and the inhabitant starts to feel like a tenant. I waited 5 minutes, then descended the stairs, empty-handed. I found them in the formal dining room. Mireille had cleared a space at the head of the table for Mr. Sterling. He was an older man, with spectacles that sat low on his nose and a face lined with the weariness of 1,000 family squabbles. He looked at me with a flicker of genuine sympathy. "Tallies," he said, standing up. "My deepest condolences. Your mother spoke of your care for her often in our correspondence." Mireille's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Yes, we've all been so grateful for Tallies's availability during this difficult time." "Mr. Sterling," I said, ignoring her. "Mireille mentioned we were going to discuss the hard parts today. I assume that means the probate and the transition of the property." "Exactly," Mireille chimed in, sliding a folder across the table. "I've prepared a preliminary inventory. To save time, Arthur, I've already flagged the items that need to be liquidated to cover the outstanding debts Mom left behind. It's quite a mess, I'm afraid." Mr. Sterling sighed, opening his briefcase. "I have the will here. As it stands, the property at 424 Hawthorne is bequeathed to Mireille, and the personal effects, including the jewelry collection, to Tallies. However, Mireille, as the sole executor, you do have the discretion to—" "Wait," I interrupted. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. Mireille's hand tightened on her wine glass. "Tallies, honey, we talked about this. You're tired. Let the professionals handle the numbers." "I'm not that tired," I said. I walked to the kitchen doorway and grabbed the Summer Preserves journal. I laid it on the table over Mireille's neat inventory list. A smudge of old strawberry jam stained her white folder. "What is this?" Mireille asked, her lip curling in disgust. "Tallies, this is hardly the time for sentimentality over recipes." "It's not a recipe," I said, opening the book to the page with the notarized codicil. I slid the paper toward Mr. Sterling. "It's the reason you couldn't find the filing at the courthouse, Mireille. Mom didn't trust you to file it. She mailed the original to herself, registered mail, and I found the envelope tucked in here. This is the copy she had notarized by the mobile notary who came to the house last month." Mr. Sterling pulled his spectacles higher and began to read. The room went unnervingly silent. Outside, I could hear the stagers banging a piece of furniture against the porch railing. "This," Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, "this is quite significant." Mireille leaned over, her eyes darting across the text. I watched the blood drain from her face until her skin looked like parchment. "This can't be legal," she hissed. "She wasn't in her right mind. Tallies, you coerced her into this. You've been whispering in her ear for years." "Read the second paragraph, Arthur," I said calmly. "Mr. Sterling read aloud. "Furthermore, in light of the significant cash gifts totaling $84,000 made to my daughter, Mireille, between 2023 and 2026, which I modernly categorize as an early advancement of her inheritance, I hereby amend the distribution of the real estate. The property at 424 Hawthorne shall be divided equally, with Tallies holding a 60% controlling interest and the right of first refusal." But that wasn't the kicker. Should Mireille attempt to contest this codicil, or should the audit of the estate reveal unauthorized withdrawals exceeding the aforementioned gifts, her interest in the property shall be forfeited in its entirety to compensate the estate for its losses. Mireille looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw her afraid. Not of me, but of the math. She knew exactly how much more she had taken than $84,000. "You think you've won?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a lethal heat. "You think you can keep this house? With what money, Tallies? You're broke. You're a middle-aged woman with a gap in her resume the size of a canyon. I'll tie this up in court until the roof collapses on your head." "I don't want to go to court," I said, leaning in. "I just want you to tell the men outside to put the furniture back. And then I want you to go upstairs and put the pearls back on the dresser." I paused, letting the sound of the ticking clock fill the space between us. "Because if you don't, I'm going to ask Mr. Sterling to begin the forensic audit of the medical consultation fees you paid yourself from Mom's checking account." Mireille's eyes flickered to the lawyer, then back to me. The mask was gone. The sturdy sister was looking at the soft one, and she realized she had no idea who I was anymore. The silence that followed was punctured by a dull thud from the hallway. The stagers had dropped a crate. Mireille flinched as if she'd been struck. Her gaze broke from mine, darting to Mr. Sterling, who was now meticulously comparing the signatures on the codicil to the original will. "Arthur," Mireille said, her voice regaining a sliver of its sharp, corporate edge, "this is a clear case of undue influence. My sister has been the only person with access to our mother for years. This document was signed under duress, or perhaps it isn't even hers." Mr. Sterling didn't look up. He traced a line of text with a weathered finger. "The notary is Sarah Vance, Mireille. She's been doing work for this firm for 20 years. She's impeccable. And as for access, the law doesn't punish a child for being a caregiver. It protects the parent's right to reward that care." He finally looked at her, his expression flat. "As for the cash gifts mentioned, if those records exist, and if they weren't reported to the estate's tax filings, we have a much larger problem than who owns the dining room table. That's bank fraud, Mireille." Mireille's throat worked in a hard swallow. She looked at the Summer Preserves journal as if it were a coiled viper. I could see her mind racing, calculating the cost of a legal battle against the cost of her reputation. She prided herself on being the success story of the family. A public audit revealing she'd been stealing from a dying woman would be social and professional suicide. "Fine," she snapped, pushing her chair back with a violent screech. "Keep the house, tallies. Keep the drafts, the dry rot, and the memories of wiping up porridge. I don't want it. But don't think for a second that this makes us even." "I don't want to be even, Mireille," I said, my voice low and steady. "I want you to be honest." She didn't answer. She stormed out of the room, her heels hammering a war drum on the floorboards. A moment later, I heard her shouting at the stagers to get their things and get out. Mr. Sterling sighed, closing his briefcase. "She's going to be a thorn in your side, tallies. This codicil gives you the controlling interest, which means you decide if the house is sold or kept. But you still owe her 40% of the appraised value if you want to buy her out. Do you have a plan for that?" I looked around the dining room. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, and the chandelier was dimmed by a decade of dust. I had exactly $12 in my purse and a mountain of bills in the kitchen drawer. "I'll find a way," I said. "I hope so," he said, standing up. "Because she won't wait. She'll trigger a partition sale the moment she finds a lawyer who thinks they can crack this codicil. You have a window of time, maybe a month, to settle the estate's debts and find a way to secure your position." After he left, the house felt cavernous. The caterers had finished, leaving behind a sterile, clean kitchen that felt wrong. I sat at the table and opened the blue folder I had hidden under my sweater. I began to categorize the checks. It wasn't just $84,000. There were smaller, more frequent withdrawals. $200 here, $500 there. ATM withdrawals from a branch near Mireille's office in the city. My mother hadn't been to an ATM in years. As I worked, I heard Mireille upstairs. She was packing. The sounds were aggressive, drawers slamming, hangers rattling. I waited for her to come down. When she appeared in the doorway an hour later, she was carrying 2 oversized suitcases. Her pearls were back on the dresser. I had checked 10 minutes prior. But she was wearing Mom's camel hair coat, the one Dad had bought her for their 25th anniversary. "I'm leaving," Mireille said. "I've booked a room at the inn. I'll be back tomorrow with a professional appraiser. Since you're so fond of the law, you won't mind if we get a fair market value on every single spoon in this place." "The appraiser is fine," I said, "but the coat stays." Mireille's eyes widened. "You have got to be joking. This is a 20-year-old piece of wool." It's Mom's, I said. And it wasn't gifted to you. Put it on the banister, Mireille. For a second, I thought she might actually lung at me. The sheer entitlement in her expression was breathtaking. She had taken thousands, yet she was willing to fight over a coat just to prove she could still take something. Slowly, she unbuttoned the coat and let it drop onto the floor. Not the banister, the floor. You're pathetic, Tallies. You've spent your life in this cage, and now you've fought for the right to die in it. Enjoy the silence. She walked out the front door, leaving it wide open. The cold evening air rushed in, smelling of wet earth and oncoming rain. I stood up, walked to the hallway, and picked up the coat. I brushed the dust off it and hung it carefully in the closet. I went back to the kitchen to finish my work, but as I reached for the ledger, I noticed something I'd missed. Tucked into the very back of the summer preserves journal, behind the codicil, was a small, yellowed envelope. It was addressed to me, in my mother's hand. For the taxes, it said. Inside was not money, but a key. A small, old-fashioned brass key with a tag that had a single word written on it, Hollow. My heart skipped. Hollow wasn't a place. It was the name of the old upright piano in the parlor, a joke between us because of the way the middle C always echoed. I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the darkened parlor. The piano was a hulking shadow against the far wall. I hadn't played it since my father died. It was out of tune, a graveyard of ivory and wire. I knelt by the pedals and felt around the base. Nothing. I opened the top lid and shone the light inside. Nothing but dust and felt. Then I remembered. When I was a child, my mother would hide our Christmas oranges in the bottom panel, behind the kickboard. I tugged at the wood. It groaned, then popped free. Behind the damp wood, nestled in the space beneath the keyboard, was a metal lockbox. I inserted the brass key. It turned with a satisfying, heavy click. I opened the lid, expecting more papers, maybe some cash. But what I saw made me drop the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its beams sweeping over the walls like a searchlight. The box was full, not with money, but with small, velvet-lined boxes. I opened one, a sapphire brooch, another, a diamond cocktail ring I'd never seen, another, a gold watch. There were dozens of them, pieces my mother had never worn, pieces that weren't in the official inventory, pieces that didn't exist on any insurance writer Mireille had access to. Beside the jewelry sat a small, handwritten note. Tallies, your father didn't trust the banks after 08. He bought these one by one. Mireille thinks she knows everything we owned because she watched the checkbook. She never watched the house. Sell what you need. Keep what you love. Be free. I sat on the floor of the parlor, surrounded by the glittering remnants of a secret life. I realized then why Mireille had never found the missing assets. She had been so busy looking for numbers on a screen that she had forgotten to look at the people in the rooms. But then a cold thought struck me. Mireille was coming back tomorrow with an appraiser, and Mireille was an executor. If she saw these, they would be added to the estate. They would be 40% hers. I looked at the open front door, still swinging slightly in the wind. I wasn't safe yet. The soft sister had to learn how to hide things, too. I sat in the dark of the parlor, the sapphire brooch cold and heavy in my palm. The light from the flashlight, still resting on the floor, cast long, distorted shadows of the piano keys against the ceiling. They looked like a row of skeletal teeth. I could almost hear Mireille's voice in the wind, rattling the window panes. I'll tie this up in court until the roof collapses on your head. If she saw this box, she wouldn't just take her 40%. She would claim I had stolen it. She would use it as proof that I was the one manipulating mom, hiding assets while pleading poverty. The martyr sister caught with a hoard of hidden gems. The narrative was too perfect for her to pass up. I had to move, now. I shoved the velvet boxes into the pockets of my cardigan and the waistband of my leggings, the hard edges digging into my skin. I replaced the piano's kickboard, kicking it firmly until the wood groaned back into place. My hands were shaking so violently, I nearly dropped the brass key. I didn't have a safe. I didn't have a car. Mireille had temporarily deactivated the insurance on Mom's old sedan the day after the funeral. I was trapped in this house with a fortune that could either save me or destroy me. I walked through the dark house, my mind racing. Where would Mireille never look? She was coming with a professional appraiser. They would check the vents, the attic, the backs of paintings. They would look for the obvious hiding spots. Mireille prided herself on being thorough. She viewed the world through a lens of suspicion, which meant she expected others to be as cunning as she was. I ended up in the basement. It was a damp, terrifying space that smelled of coal dust and forgotten winters. In the corner sat the old chest freezer, a hulking white beast that hummed with a low, dying rattle. It was filled with years of Mom's, just in case, cooking bags of frozen peas from 2019, unidentified soups in plastic tubs, and dozens of loaves of bread. Mireille loathed the basement. She called it a litigation nightmare because of the steep stairs and the peeling lead paint. She wouldn't go down there unless she absolutely had to, and she certainly wouldn't dig through frost-bitten bags of spinach. I grabbed a gallon-sized freezer bag. I wrapped each jewelry box in layers of aluminum foil to disguise the shape, then shoved them into the bag. I buried the bag at the very bottom of the freezer, beneath 3 heavy, ice-crusted bags of soup bones. As I climbed back up the stairs, the front door creaked. I froze, my hand on the basement door. The house was supposed to be empty. Mireille was at the inn. "Tallies." The voice was masculine, low, and hesitant. I peered around the corner. Standing in the foyer, illuminated by the street lamp outside, was a man I hadn't seen in nearly 4 years. Caleb. He was wearing a rain-streaked canvas jacket, his hair damp. He looked older, tired, but his eyes still held that same quiet steadiness that had once made me feel like I could breathe. Caleb had been the one I'd pushed away when Mom's care became a full-time haunting. I had told him I couldn't be a girlfriend and a nurse at the same time, and he had been too respectful to argue. "The door was wide open," he said, stepping further into the hall. "I saw the light from the street. I heard about your mother, Tallies. I'm so sorry." I leaned against the wall, the adrenaline from the basement leaving me in a sudden, crashing wave of exhaustion. Mireille left it open. She likes to leave a trail of chaos behind her. Caleb walked toward me, stopping just outside my personal space. He smelled of rain and cedar. "I heard she's being difficult. The whole town is talking about the stagers arriving before the wake was even over." "She's more than difficult, Caleb. She's an architect of her own reality." I looked at him, really looked at him. "Why are you here? It's nearly midnight." "I saw her car at the inn," he said quietly. "I figured if she was there, you were here alone, and I knew you wouldn't have eaten. You always forget to eat when you're cornered." He held up a small paper bag from the local diner. The smell of greasy grilled cheese hit me, and my stomach cramped painfully. "I can't stay, Caleb," I whispered, the weight of the secret in the freezer pressing on my mind. "I have so much to do. Mireille is bringing an appraiser in the morning. She's trying to force a sale." "Then let me help you move the heavy stuff," he said, setting the bag on the kitchen table. "Not the furniture, the things you actually want to keep, before they get a price tag slapped on them." I looked at him, and for a split second, I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to tell him about the blue folder, the piano, and the sapphire brooch currently chilling next to the soup bones. But then I remembered Mireille's face, the way she looked at people like they were assets to be leveraged. If I involved Caleb, I was putting him in her crosshairs. Mireille didn't just beat her enemies, she dismantled their lives. "I can't," I said, my voice hardening. "I need to do this alone. If she sees you here, she'll use it. She'll say I'm using estate funds to support a boyfriend. She'll make it ugly, Caleb, uglier than it already is." Caleb's expression didn't change, but I saw the slight flinch in his jaw. "You're still doing it, Tallies. You're still trying to carry the whole house on your back so no one else gets crushed. But look at the walls. They're already cracking." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "The appraiser she hired, it's Victor Thorne. He's a shark. He does high-end estates in the city, but he's been in Mireille's pocket for years. He'll lowball the house to make it an easy flip for her investor friends, and he'll overvalue the contents you're supposed to inherit to balance the books. My heart stopped. How do you know that? I work for the county clerk now, Caleb said. I see the filings. I see who signs the papers. He stepped out into the night, closing the door firmly this time. I sat at the kitchen table and opened the bag. The grilled cheese was lukewarm, the bread soggy. I ate it anyway, staring at the basement door. Mireille wasn't just trying to get her share. She was rigging the game. She was going to make sure that even if I kept the house, I would be so buried in valuation debt to her that I'd never be able to pay her out. I looked at the kitchen clock. 5 hours until dawn. I didn't need to hide the jewelry. I needed to hide the value of the entire world I was standing in. If Thorne was a shark, I needed to turn the house into a shipwreck, something no investor would touch. The 5 hours before dawn were the longest of my life. If Victor Thorne was coming to undervalue the bones of this house and overvalue my inheritance, I had to change the narrative of the rooms. Mireille expected me to be the grieving, desperate sister clinging to memories. She didn't expect me to understand the mechanics of a survey. I didn't break anything. That would be too obvious. Instead, I went to the attic and moved the heavy trunks away from the corner where the old roof leak had been repaired 2 summers ago. I peeled back the fresh patch of wallpaper I'd painstakingly applied myself. Beneath it, the water damage was an ugly, dark blossom, not structural, but deeply unappealing to an appraiser's eye. I moved to the bathroom and loosened the nut on the sink's P-trap, just enough to let a slow, rhythmic drip-drip-drip echo against the porcelain. In the basement, I switched off the pilot light on the water heater. By the time the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly yellow over the horizon, the house felt cold, damp, and fundamentally broken. At 8:00 a.m. sharp, a silver European sedan pulled into the driveway, followed closely by Mireille's rental. Mireille stepped out, looking like she'd stepped off a magazine cover, charcoal wool coat, oversized sunglasses, and a sharp, triumphant stride. Beside her was a man who could only be Victor Thorne. He was thin, silver-haired, and wore a suit that probably cost more than my mother's car. He carried a leather-bound tablet like a weapon. I met them on the porch. I had purposefully not brushed my hair, and I wore an old, oversized sweater of Mom's that smelled faintly of mothballs. I wanted to look exactly like the unstable, overwhelmed woman Mireille had been describing to her friends. "Tallies," Mireille said, her voice dripping with a synthetic sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "This is Victor. He's here to help us reach a fair conclusion so we can all move on." Victor gave me a curt, professional nod that didn't reach his eyes. "A pleasure. Let's start with the exterior and the structural integrity, shall we?" I stood back and watched. They moved through the house like surgeons. Mireille pointed out the charming features she wanted recorded for her eventual sale, the original crown molding, the stained glass transom. But every time she pointed up, I made sure they noticed the damp patch in the corner. "Is that mold?" Victor asked, leaning in with a small flashlight. "The roof has been a struggle," I said, my voice sounding appropriately defeated. "I've tried to keep up with it, but the last storm, well, I think it's in the rafters now." Mireille shot me a look of pure venom. "It's a minor leak, Victor, easily fixed." "Water is never minor in a Victorian, Mireille," Victor noted, tapping a note into his tablet. We moved to the dining room. I watched as Victor lingered on the heavy silver service and the mahogany table. "Now these pieces," Victor said, his tone shifting. "Excellent condition, high provenance. This silver alone could fetch a significant sum at a boutique auction." This was the play Caleb had warned me about. He was going to inflate the price of the personal effects, my 60%, while dragging down the value of the house itself. By the time he was done, the math would show that I already owned my share of the estate in the form of expensive spoons and jewelry, leaving Mireille to claim the deed to the house as her remaining portion. "And the jewelry?" Victor asked, his eyes scanning the room. Mireille mentioned a substantial collection. "In the bedroom," I said, leading them upstairs. I watched as he opened the small, cherrywood jewelry box on the dresser. He pulled out the Mikimoto pearls Mireille had been forced to return. He held them to the light, nodding. Beautiful. We'll need to certify the clasp. He spent an hour cataloging every trinket. I stayed silent, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I thought of the freezer in the basement. I thought of the sapphire brooch nestled under the frozen soup bones. If he was a shark, he was a shark who hadn't realized the biggest prize was in the kitchen. Well, Victor said, snapping his tablet shut after 2 hours. I have enough for a preliminary. The house has significant deferred maintenance. The roof, the plumbing, the heating system. I'd place the market value quite low, perhaps 40% below the neighborhood average. Mireille sighed, a theatrical sound. It's a shame, but given the circumstances of the last few years, I suppose neglect is to be expected. However, Victor continued, the contents are remarkable. Between the silver, the jewelry, and the antiques, the movable assets are nearly equal to the value of the equity. It's a very clean split, really. Tallies keeps the items, Mireille keeps the deed. Minimal paperwork. Mireille looked at me, a glimmer of the old hunter in her eyes. It's the most logical path, Tallies. You love these things. You've lived with them. Why not keep them and let me handle the burden of the property? I looked at the peeling wallpaper and then at Victor. And the cash gifts, I asked quietly. The ones mentioned in the codicil, how do those factor into your clean split? Victor's face went stiff. Mireille's smile didn't just falter, it vanished. Those are a separate accounting matter, Victor said smoothly. Actually, I said, Mr. Sterling said they are an advancement of inheritance, which means Mireille has already spent $84,000 of her share of this house. If the house is valued as low as you're saying, Victor, then Mireille's remaining interest in the property is almost zero. The silence in the room became a physical weight. Mireille stepped toward me, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think you're so smart. You think you can use Mom's dementia-fueled scribbles to cheat me out of my childhood home. I'm not cheating you, Mireille. I'm just reading the numbers you provided. You want to play with numbers? Mireille hissed. Let's talk about the missing pieces, then. I grew up in this house, too. I know what Dad bought. I know there was a sapphire brooch. I know there was a gold Piaget watch. They aren't in that box, Tallies. She turned to Victor, her finger trembling as she pointed at me. She's hidden them. She's stolen from the estate. I want a full search warrant. I want every floorboard in this house ripped up until we find what she's tucked away. Victor looked uncomfortable. Mireille, we don't have proof of. I am the executor, she screamed, her composure finally shattering. I have the right to secure the assets. Victor, write down that the inventory is incomplete due to suspected theft by the resident. I stood my ground, my hands tucked into the pockets of my mothballed sweater. There's no theft, Mireille. Maybe Mom sold them to pay for the medical consultations you were charging her for. Mireille lunged. It wasn't a hit, but a grab. She snatched the collar of my sweater, her face inches from mine. I will ruin you, she breathed. I will have the police here by noon. She didn't see the shadow in the doorway, but I did. Caleb was standing there, his county clerk badge clipped to his belt, holding a stack of official-looking blue envelopes. Actually, Mireille, Caleb said, his voice echoing in the hallway. You might want to hold off on calling the police. I'm here to serve the notice of a state-mandated tax audit. It seems there's a discrepancy between the estate's reported liquid assets and the bank records we just pulled. Mireille let go of my sweater, spinning around. You, what are you doing here? Doing my job, Caleb said, walking into the room. He didn't look at me, but I felt the support of his presence like a bracing wind. And as part of an audit involving suspected fraud, all executorship powers are suspended until a court-appointed third party can verify the ledger. He handed the blue envelope to Mireille. You're no longer in charge of the spoons, Mireille, or the house. Mireille stared at the envelope as if it were a death warrant, but I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at Victor Thorne, who was already backing toward the door, trying to distance himself from a woman who was suddenly radioactive. The shipwreck was sinking, and for the first time I wasn't the one drowning. The silence that followed Caleb's announcement was thick and metallic, the kind of quiet that precedes a structural collapse. Mireille stared at the blue envelope in her hand as if the paper itself were scorching her skin. Her knuckles were white, the rings on her fingers, likely also borrowed from Mom's collection, glinting in the morning light. A state-mandated audit? Mireille's voice was a jagged whisper. She turned her gaze to Victor Thorne, who was already meticulously cleaning his spectacles, his eyes averted. "Victor, tell him this is a procedural error. Tell him we have the filing receipts." Victor cleared his throat, his professional veneer finally cracking. "Mireille, if the county clerk's office has flagged a discrepancy in the liquid assets prior to probate, that's outside my jurisdiction. My valuation is based on the assets presented. If the asset list is under legal dispute, my report is, well, it's paused." He didn't wait for her to argue. He didn't even say goodbye to me. He tucked his tablet under his arm and retreated down the stairs, his footsteps echoing with the haste of a man fleeing a burning building. Mireille whirled on Caleb. "This is personal. You've always hated me because I saw through you. You're using your pathetic little government job to harass me." Caleb didn't flinch. He stayed planted in the doorway, a solid, unmovable force. "I didn't flag the account, Mireille. The bank did. When you tried to wire $40,000 from your mother's savings to a private brokerage account yesterday afternoon, 4 hours after the funeral, the system triggered a fraud alert. Since the death certificate hadn't been processed by the state yet, you were essentially moving money from a dead woman's account without a cleared probate." My stomach turned. Yesterday, while I was sitting in the dark of the kitchen, Mireille was already trying to drain the marrow from the bones. "I was securing the funds," Mireille shrieked. "Tally's is incompetent. I couldn't leave the money in an account she has a debit card for." "I don't have a debit card for that account, Mireille," I said, my voice cold and flat. "I haven't had access to Mom's savings in 2 years. You made sure of that when you changed the mailing address for the statements to your office." Mireille looked between us, the realization finally dawning on her that she was no longer the smartest person in the room. The soft sister had an ally, and the sturdy sister had a paper trail. "This won't hold," Mireille said, her voice trembling with a terrifying, quiet rage. "I'll have an injunction by Monday. And Tally's, enjoy your moldy rafters while you can. Because when the auditor sees that the controlling interest holder is a woman with no income and a house full of hidden jewelry, they'll realize who the real thief is." She shoved past Caleb, her shoulder hitting his with a dull thud. We watched from the window as she threw herself into her rental car, tires screaming against the gravel as she tore out of the driveway. Caleb let out a long, slow breath. He turned to me, his face softening. "You okay?" I'm vibrating," I admitted, leaning against the dresser. "Is it true, the wire transfer?" "Every word," Caleb said. "She got greedy, Tallies. She thought that because she was the executor, the money was already hers. She didn't realize that being an executor is a fiduciary duty, not a prize." He stepped closer, his eyes scanning my face. "But she wasn't lying about the audit. They're going to go through everything, including your bank records." My heart hammered. "I have nothing to hide in my bank records. I have $12, Caleb." "I know," he said. "But if there are things in this house, things that aren't on the official inventory, you need to be very careful. If the state auditor finds them before you report them, it looks like embezzlement." I looked toward the hallway, thinking of the basement, the freezer, and the sapphire brooch currently nestled in the ice. I wanted to tell him. The words were right there, resting on the tip of my tongue. But the trauma of the last 3 years had taught me a bitter lesson. Even the kindest hands can be forced to sign a statement. "I understand," I said. Caleb stayed for another hour, helping me tighten the P-trap in the bathroom and restart the pilot light on the water heater. He didn't ask why I had loosened them. He just worked in a comfortable silence that reminded me of the life I'd had before the house became a cage. "I have to get back to the office," he said eventually, standing at the back door. "The court-appointed administrator will be here Tuesday. Her name is Mrs. Gable. She's tough, but she's fair. If you're honest with her, she'll help you navigate the buyout." "Thank you, Caleb, for everything." He reached out, his hand hovering near my arm for a second before he pulled back. "Just hang on, Tallies. The walls aren't falling yet." After he left, I went to the basement. I opened the freezer. The fog rolled out, cold and biting. I reached under the bags of soup bones and pulled out the foil-wrapped package. I took it to the kitchen table and began to unwrap the pieces. In the harsh daylight, the jewelry was even more magnificent and even more dangerous. The sapphire was the blue of a deep ocean, surrounded by diamonds that caught the light and threw it against the kitchen walls like tiny, mocking stars. If I gave these to Mrs. Gable, 40% went to Mireille. Mireille would use that money to hire a better lawyer to fight the audit. I would be funding my own destruction. But if I kept them hidden, I was a criminal. I looked at the sapphire. Then, I noticed something I hadn't seen in the dark of the parlor. On the inside of the velvet box for the Piaget watch, there was a tiny, tucked-in slip of paper. It wasn't a receipt. It was a business card for a gallery in the city, dated 6 months ago. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were 4 words that changed everything. Already appraised, name, Tallies. My mother hadn't just hidden these. She had already legally gifted them to me before she died. She had been playing the long game, too. I realized then that the blue folder wasn't the only trap she'd set for Mireille. There was one more piece of the puzzle, and I knew exactly where to find it. I grabbed my coat and headed for the old garden shed at the edge of the property, the place where my father had kept his woodworking tools, and where my mother had spent her final healthy summer potting plants. If Mom had gone to the city to get an appraisal, she hadn't gone alone. She couldn't drive. I pulled open the rusted door of the shed. The smell of earth and dried lavender hit me. I started digging through the old terracotta pots, looking for the one thing Mireille would never touch, the bag of special fertilizer Mom had guarded like gold. I found the bag. Inside, wrapped in heavy plastic, was a second phone, a cheap burner flip phone. I turned it on. The battery was low, but it flickered to life. There was only one contact in the address book. The driver. I hit dial. "Hello," a woman's voice answered. She sounded young, professional. "My name is Tallies," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm Calla's daughter." There was a long pause on the other end. "I've been waiting for your call, Tallies. Your mother said you'd find the phone once the storm hit. We have a lot to talk about regarding the private trust." Trust. The word sounded like a bell ringing in a quiet room. Mireille had been looking for a bank account. She hadn't been looking for a legal entity. "I'm listening," I said, leaning against the potting bench. "Your mother didn't just leave you a house," the woman said. "She left you a way out, but we have to move fast. Mireille's lawyer just filed an emergency motion to seize the clutter in the house." The storm wasn't over. It was just changing direction. The woman on the phone identified herself as Alina Vance, the daughter of Sarah Vance, the notary. As I stood in the damp, dirt-floored shed, the burner phone pressed to my ear, the reality of my mother's quiet brilliance began to unfold. "My mother was Calla's secret for 2 years," Alina said, her voice crisp and urgent. "Your sister monitored the mail, the landline, and the bank accounts, but she never checked the local transit records. I was the one who drove your mother to the city when you were at your support group meetings. I was the one who helped her set up the Calla Lilly Trust." "A trust," I whispered. "How, with what money?" "Small amounts over a long time," Alina explained. "She'd have you withdraw cash for groceries or household repairs. You'd give her the envelopes and she'd pass them to me. It wasn't much at first, but she also sold several smaller pieces of jewelry through a private broker, pieces Mireille never knew existed. That money was used to fund a life insurance policy that names the trust as the beneficiary. And the trust, it's for you, Tallies, solely you." I sat down on a bag of mulch, my head spinning. Those moments when I thought Mom was slipping, when she would ask for extra cash and then lose it, she wasn't losing it at all. She was building a wall between me and Mireille's greed, brick by painstaking brick. "Mireille's motion to seize the clutter is a desperation move," Alina continued. "She knows the audit will catch her. She wants to get into that house and remove anything of value before the court-appointed administrator locks the doors on Tuesday. She's claiming the house is unsafe and that the estate assets are being mismanaged by an unstable resident. She's coming back tonight, isn't she? I asked, looking toward the dark silhouette of the Victorian. The order hasn't been signed yet, but Mireille has never been one for waiting for permission. If I were you, Tallies, I'd make sure anything you want to keep is no longer in that house by sunset. I'm sending a courier to you now with the trust documents. Once you sign them, the jewelry in your possession can be legally transferred into the trust's inventory. It becomes protected property. I hung up, my heart hammering. I had 4 hours. I ran back to the house, the wind picking up, whistling through the eaves. I went straight to the basement and retrieved the foil-wrapped package from the freezer. My fingers were numb from the ice, but I didn't stop. I hauled the jewelry back to the kitchen and waited. An hour later, a nondescript gray sedan pulled into the driveway. A young man in a courier uniform handed me a heavy manila envelope. "Sign on the yellow tabs," he said. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Mireille had tried to intimidate me with her inventory, and I signed my name over and over. I was signing for my freedom. I was signing for the years I spent in the dark, the years Mireille had treated like a taxable commodity. Just as the courier pulled away, the sky turned a bruised purple. I started packing. Not the big things, not the mahogany table or the silver. I packed my mother's journals, the old photo albums that Mireille had called paper trash, and the camel hair coat. I was halfway through the closet when I heard the sound of a heavy vehicle in the driveway. I looked out the window. It wasn't Mireille's rental. It was a moving truck, and behind it a black town car. Mireille stepped out, followed by 2 men in work jumpsuits. She wasn't wearing her morning clothes anymore. She was in a leather jacket and jeans, her hair pulled back in a tight, severe ponytail. She looked like she was going to war. I met her at the front door, the manila envelope clutched to my chest. "Move, Tallies," she said, her voice devoid of any pretense. "I have a signed affidavit stating that the property is at risk of theft. I'm here to inventory and secure the contents. If you interfere, the men behind me have instructions to call the sheriff." "You don't have a signed order from a judge, Mireille," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my legs. "You have an affidavit. That's just a lie you told a notary." "It's enough for now," she hissed, stepping into the foyer. She didn't look at me. She looked at the house like it was a carcass she was about to butcher. "Boys, start with the dining room. Everything in the sideboard goes into the padded crates. Then the parlor, the piano stays, but everything else is on the list." "Don't touch the silver," I said. Mireille laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Or what? You'll call Caleb. He's off the clock, Tallies. And by the time he gets here, the clutter will be in a climate-controlled warehouse under my legal name." She turned to her movers. "What are you waiting for? Get to work." As the men moved toward the dining room, I pulled a single sheet of paper from my envelope, the one with the official stamp of the Calla Lily Trust. "Actually, Mireille," I said, my voice cutting through the sound of their heavy boots, "you might want to check the updated title registry. As of 1 hour ago, the contents of 424 Hawthorne, specifically the silver, the jewelry, and all heirlooms, have been transferred into a private trust, a trust of which I am the sole trustee." Mireille stopped. She turned slowly, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about? Mom didn't have a trust." "She did," I said. "She set it up while I was isolating her. While you were too busy to visit, she was making sure you could never touch the things she loved." I stepped forward into her space. "The house is still part of the probate. You can stand here and argue about the walls all you want, but the items in this house, they don't belong to the estate anymore. They belong to me." Mireille's face contorted. She looked at the movers, then back at me. She saw the paper. She saw the seal. And for the first time, she saw that the soft sister had been holding a knife behind her back the entire time. "You bitch," she whispered. "The movers can leave, Mireille," I said, "before I call the police and report a burglary in progress." But Mireille didn't order them to leave. Instead, she looked at the basement door. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. The jewelry, Tallies. You moved it, didn't you? You didn't leave it in the safe. You didn't leave it in the bedroom. She stepped closer, her voice a low, melodic threat. If it's in the trust, it has to be documented. If you've hidden it and it's not on the trust's initial filing, then you've just committed insurance fraud. She began to walk toward the kitchen, toward the basement. I wonder, she said, what's in that old freezer of yours? My heart didn't just skip. It seemed to stop entirely, a cold stone in my chest. I watched Mireille's hand hover over the basement door handle. She was guessing, hunting for the scent of my panic. She had always been a predator of the nerves, sensing the exact moment when someone's resolve began to fray. The freezer, I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. It's full of expired soup, Mireille. If you're that hungry for the estate's assets, help yourself to the freezer-burned broth. She didn't laugh. She turned the glass knob, the old mechanism clicking like a lock. You were always a terrible liar, Tallies. You get that little twitch in your left eyelid. You've had it since we were kids and you tried to hide the neighbor's cat in your closet. She stepped onto the top landing of the basement stairs. The movers stood awkwardly in the foyer, their heavy packing blankets draped over their arms like funeral shrouds. They knew they were witnessing something ugly, something private, but the lure of their hourly wage kept them anchored to the floorboards. I followed her down. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and the iron scent of the old furnace. Mireille reached the bottom and headed straight for the white chest freezer. She looked like an apparition in her expensive leather jacket against the gray, weeping stone walls. You think you're so clever with your trust, she said, her breath blooming in a small cloud. But a trust is a legal vessel. If the vessel is filled with stolen goods, it sinks. I know the inventory tallies. I have Dad's old insurance appraisals from the 90s. She gripped the handle of the freezer and flung it open. The interior light flickered, casting a sickly blue glow over the frosted bags. She began to dig, tossing frozen loaves of bread and bags of peas onto the concrete floor with a wet thud. Where is it? She hissed. The sapphire, the pie agate. I know they aren't in the trust filing because I checked the public registry on my phone in the car. You just signed the transfer, which means the inventory hasn't been updated yet. If I find them here in a bag of bones before they're registered, it's not a trust asset. It's evidence. I stood by the stairs, watching the soup bones fly. My mother's journals were clutched in my arms. I felt a strange, sudden calm. It was the calm of a person who has already lost everything and realized the world didn't end. There's nothing there, Mireille, I said quietly. She reached the bottom. She moved the last heavy bag of beef marrow. Her hand brushed the floor of the freezer. She froze. Her fingers curled around nothing but ice. She turned around, her face flushed with a mixture of confusion and humiliated rage. Where are they? I saw you coming up from here earlier. I saw the frost on your sweater. I was getting dinner, I said, and then I realized I wasn't hungry. I stepped closer to her, the light of the freezer silhouetting me. I didn't put them back in the freezer, Mireille. I'm not as predictable as you think. The truth was, I had moved the package one last time. When the courier had arrived with the manila envelope, I hadn't just signed the papers. I had handed him the foil-wrapped bundle. He was more than a courier. He was Alina Vance's brother. The jewelry was already halfway to a secure vault in the city, documented and witnessed by a third-party legal representative. Mireille slammed the freezer lid shut. The sound echoed through the basement like a gunshot. You think this is a victory? She screamed, her voice cracking. You're sitting in a house that's literally rotting around you. I'll have the audit tied up for years. I'll make sure you never get a dime from the life insurance. I'll burn this whole estate to the ground before I let you have the satisfaction of winning. You already burned it, Mireille, I said. You burned it every time you chose a wire transfer over a visit. You burned it every time you spoke to Mom like she was a ledger to be closed. You aren't fighting for a house. You're fighting for a price tag, and the price just went up. I walked back up the stairs, leaving her in the cold dark of the basement. In the foyer, I looked at the movers. The owner of the house has asked you to leave, I said, gesturing to myself. If you take so much as a silver spoon, I will press charges against your company. I suggest you go. They didn't argue. They saw the look in my eyes, the look of a woman who had spent 3 years staring into the face of death and was no longer afraid of a man in a jumpsuit. They dropped their blankets and walked out the front door. A moment later, Mireille emerged from the basement. She looked small. For the first time in my life, she didn't look like the successful, powerful older sister. She looked like a woman who had realized her currency was no longer accepted here. She walked to the front door, stopping at the threshold. She didn't look back at the house. She looked at me. "You'll regret this, Tallies. When the roof leaks and the heater fails and you're all alone in this graveyard, you'll wish you taken the money." "I'm not alone," I said. "I have the memories you were too busy to make." She slammed the door so hard the stained glass in the transom rattled. I stood in the silence of the foyer, listening to the sound of her car speeding away for the final time. The house was quiet, truly quiet, no more ticking of machines. No more labored breathing, no more clicking heels. I went to the kitchen and sat at the table. I picked up one of my mother's recipe journals. I opened it to a random page. Peach Cobbler, 1998. In the margin, in my mother's elegant script, it said, "Tallies loved the crust. Make sure to save her the corners." I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. The battle was over, but the house was still broken. I had a 60% share of a shipwreck and a mountain of debt. But as I sat there, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even known I was carrying. Then the phone on the counter rang. Not the burner, the landline. I picked it up. "Hello." "Tallies, it's Arthur Sterling." The lawyer's voice sounded tired, but there was a new note in it, a note of urgency. "I just received a call from the state auditor. They've finished the preliminary scan of your sister's firm's accounts." My hand tightened on the receiver. "And it's not just your mother's money, Tallies. It seems Mireille has been creative with several of her clients' estates. The wire transfer yesterday was a desperate attempt to cover a shortfall in another account. They aren't just suspending her executorship. They're filing criminal charges." The room seemed to tilt. Criminal. Embezzlement, Tallies, grand larceny. She's not going to be fighting you for the house. She's going to be fighting to stay out of a cell, which means her interest in the property is now subject to a state lien. Unless. "Unless what?" I asked. "Unless the primary beneficiary can prove the estate was a victim of her crimes. If you can show she cost the estate more than her 40% share, the court can strip her interest entirely to make the estate whole." I looked at the kitchen door, at the indentation in the rug where the hospital bed had been. "I have the ledger, Arthur," I said. "I have the whole story." The following months didn't feel like a victory. They felt like a long, slow exhale. The chaos Mireille had predicted never came to pass. Instead, the house entered a period of profound, healing stillness. With Arthur Sterling's help and the shadow ledger I had recovered from the blue folder, the state's case against Mireille was surgical. It turned out she hadn't just been stealing from Mom. She had been treating her entire client list like a personal piggy bank. The 60% controlling interest I held became 100% once the court calculated the total of her unauthorized consultation fees and the damage she had done to the estate's liquidity. She didn't go to prison, not yet, but she lost everything else. Her firm, her brownstone, and that carefully curated reputation of the sturdy success story. The last I heard, she was living in a studio apartment in the city, working as a junior bookkeeper for a construction firm, her designer heels replaced by sensible flats. She hasn't called. I haven't reached out. Some silences are earned. I used a portion of the jewelry from the Calla Lily Trust, the gold watch and a few smaller rings, to pay off the medical debts and fix the roof. I didn't sell the sapphire brooch. I keep it in a small velvet bag under my pillow, not for its value, but because it feels like a piece of my mother's heart I was finally allowed to hold. It's autumn now. The Victorian is no longer a shipwreck. It's a home again. The damp patches have been scrubbed away, the boiler hums with a steady, reliable rhythm, and the garden is tucked in for the winter. Caleb came over this morning. He didn't bring documents or blue envelopes. He brought a crate of apples from his father's orchard and a toolkit. He spent the last 2 hours in the parlor, patiently tuning the old piano. "The middle C is still a little stubborn," he called out, his voice muffled by the piano's mahogany lid. "It's supposed to be," I said, walking in with 2 mugs of cider. "It's the hollow note. It reminds me where things are hidden." He emerged from behind the instrument, his face smudged with dust but his eyes bright. He looked at the room, the polished silver on the sideboard, the camel hair coat hanging neatly by the door, the absence of tension in the air. "You did it, Tallies," he said softly. "You kept the light in the room." "No," I said, setting the mugs down on the small table. "I just stopped letting someone else blow it out." I walked to the window. The leaves were turning a deep, fiery gold, falling gently onto the porch steps. For 3 years, I had watched the seasons change through the glass of a sick room, measuring time in dosages and heartbeats. I had been a nurse, a martyr, a victim, and a thief of my own joy. But today, I was just a woman in her own house. I reached out and touched the ivory keys of the piano. I pressed the middle C. The note rang out, clear and resonant, echoing through the hallway and up the stairs, filling the corners where the shadows used to live. It wasn't a perfect sound, but it was a true one. I realized then that justice doesn't always look like a gavel hitting a block or a sister in handcuffs. Sometimes, justice is just the smell of wood smoke in a warm kitchen, the sound of a friend's laughter in the parlor, and the knowledge that you can finally go to sleep without checking the locks on your heart. I am no longer waiting for the storm. I am the one who survived it. And as I looked at Caleb, and then at the house that had once been my cage and was now my sanctuary, I realized that my mother's greatest gift wasn't the jewelry or the trust. It was the silence, the beautiful, hard-won silence of a life that finally belongs to me. I picked up my cider and sat on the piano bench beside Caleb. "Play something," I said. "Anything but a dirge." He smiled, his fingers finding a simple, bright melody. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't look at the clock. I didn't look at the door. I just listened.